Hello, it's Jacqueline Limoges again, and I'm here to take you through week 3 of the Development of Self, Ethical Ways of Knowing and Caring course. In the last week and the readings again for this week, I'm asking you to think about and to learn some very complex approaches to reasoning within ethical situations. What I'm trying to do here in this course, and the ultimate goal of these first 4 weeks of the course, is to expose you to a variety of theories, approaches, models, and ethical views to give you a broad range of tools so that when you're faced with an ethical dilemma or ethical tensions in your practice, that you have a multitude of ways of understanding what is happening. Ultimately, the goal is that you would have skills and different lenses and different approaches to understand ethical situations and ultimately to be able to move into ethical decisions and an ethical practice, both for yourself, for your patients, and in a more broad way for the overall healthcare system of Canada. Lofty goals, I realize, but very worthwhile in the end. So specifically this week, what we're trying to do is first do a review of what and a recap of what happened last week, and then I'm going to present to you an introductory few comments about relational feminist care and narrative ethics. Then we're going to explore how these approaches influence nurses' ethical thinking and how these ideas are relevant for ethical practice and decision making in the contemporary context. We're going to examine and critique the limits of these theories that we're learning about this week. And then we're going to examine how the development of ethical knowledge promotes nurses' work in their local and global mandate by exploring clinical situations described in the 2 required journal readings for this week. And lastly, we're going to clarify personal values and begin to examine how these influence nurses' professional practice. This is key, as you will see in the decision-making model, that we understand how our own values and belief systems are entering into first what we notice as an ethical situation, and then how we understand that situation to be ethical. So by way of review, as I've been mentioning, we study ethics so that we can justify our decisions. Last week, I presented 4 different ways, and this week there'll be 4 more. And then next week, we'll be talking about how the law also influences our decision making. What we're ultimately trying to do is we're trying to make the best decision, which is not always the right decision. It's very confusing sometimes what really will contribute to the good and what is best or right in any given situation. We're trying to also work through strategies that help us to align our own personal values to our decisions, and also how our professional values align with the decisions that we make, and to begin to explore and understand why sometimes there are tensions. As you reflect on the contributions to virtue ethics, I have some questions that you can pause the slide and consider the implications of virtue ethics to our practice. For example, the question, in a caring situation, do you sometimes cease to care objectively? If no one watches us, are we still motivated to care? And who decides what is right and wrong? Virtue ethics begins to help us think about care and helps us begin to think about how we act as a person in terms of promoting the good. Deontology asks us to think about our duty and asks us to think about rules and laws and principles. And some of the questions that may help you think about the contributions to deontology: is it easier to care for a priest or a prisoner? If you give care grudgingly, is it still care? Deontology asks us to think about the notion that if we act in one way, we must always act in this way. And this lays out duty and removes personal decisions and personal judgments. And consequentialism or utilitarianism, on the other hand, asks us to consider the sanctity of life versus the quality of life. It asks us to consider the consequences of our decisions, and all the while thinking about the greatest good for the greatest number. The theories that were presented last week have been critiqued as being overly androcentric, meaning that they've been predominantly created with a male form of knowledge. But what we do see running through the theories of last week, including bioethics, is the idea of reason, is the idea that we can act in a certain way, that disciplines our thinking and add structure to it. And I have this little cartoon here, make sure everything is done ethically, within reason, of course, as a play on the term reason. In the week 1 folder, in part 1 of the video clips that I would ask you to watch, is the beginning clip from the video Wit that features Emma Thompson. We're going to be watching this movie in its entirety over the next few weeks. But what I would ask you to do first is to watch the first clip, and while you're watching it, to really think about autonomy and reason. The theories that we discussed last week have as their cornerstones these ideas of autonomy, people being able to make their own decisions, and people acting with reason. And as you watch this clip, I'd like you to think about what are the limits of autonomy. This will situate you for being able to critique some of the theories that we presented last week to find the value of their contributions, and will also position you to begin considering some of the theories that we'll be presenting this week that pay attention to other parts of ethical reasoning. So if you haven't already done so, please go look at the first part of the WIT video. Okay, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that first clip. And some of the questions that came to my mind as I watched the clip, and I wanted to ask you about your perspective, is do we really have autonomy? So if ethical practice is based around this idea of autonomy, is it something that actually exists? Do some people have more autonomy than others? As you watched the clip, I wondered if you noticed some of the power relations in healthcare. And being able to identify these and to see them and to be able to address them from the view of the contextual theories that we'll be considering this week are key for ethical practice. How does this clip contribute to your understanding of the limits of the normative approaches to ethics? By normative approaches, I mean the approaches that we studied last week. And are there situations where we have more autonomy than others? And again, this points to the idea of looking at context. Okay, as I mentioned, we'll return to the discussions of the WIT video. And in fact, we'll be using the first part of the WIT video as our case study for this week. But for now, let's remember that video clip, but let's move forward. I'm wondering what you've noticed in practicum. One of the learning outcomes of this course is to develop ethical sensitivity. And by that I mean being able to look around your midst of your practice setting and to identify what is an ethical dilemma, what are ethical tensions, what are ethical issues, and to be able to distinguish those from other concerns such as interpersonal concerns. However, at times they're certainly intermingled. But we need to be able to recognize what is the ethical so that we can use these tools and these strategies and approaches and theories that we're learning to be able to reconcile or resolve these issues. So what I'm doing each week in the forums is I'm creating a spot where you can post ethical issues that you're encountering in your practice for other students to respond to, or for you to be able to just write about your experience for us to consider. If you're not comfortable doing so, I would encourage you to keep personal reflections on the ethical situations that you're encountering. And just a little reminder, to please be sure that anything you post in the Blackboard is posted with all of the patient's names removed, any kind of identifying data for the patient or the agency. So part of the premise of this idea of noticing what you're encountering in practicum is recognizing that as soon as there are two people, issues of justice emerge. And issues of justice are inherently central to issues of ethical practice. Aristotle reminded us that with the explosion of science comes the need for the explosion of ethical reasoning. And as things become more technical and more scientific, we need to have a greater variety of ways to consider the ethics. And part of recognizing the ethics in a situation is recognizing that our healthcare system is not neutral, that it carries values and beliefs and a certain way of seeing the world. Ethicists have suggested that as soon as two people come in contact with each other, there is the possibility for ethical dilemmas. So this asks us to look at the social life versus the solitary life. And certainly everything that happens in healthcare is part of the social life. The nurse comes into contact with the patient, therefore making it part of the social. And we can see here from this picture of the two boys, there's only one boogie board, and somehow they have to find a way to share it. They have to find a way to engage in this play and adjust in a right way so that there is happiness for all. And we can see that if one person is always getting his way, that will be to the detriment of the other. And so there is a need for coming together and a need to explore what is ethical, what is good, and what will promote happiness in this context. In addition, Lenara in 1981 suggested that at almost every moment, a nurse is confronted with the need to choose between a greater and a lesser good. And this is important for us to stop and pause for a moment. Sometimes we think of ethical situations or ethical dilemmas being really dramatic, end-of-life decisions, terminating treatment. But what we're trying to do in this course is to recognize that it's very much in the everyday, every night practice of the nurse that ethical dilemmas arise. Whether we decide to give a patient his or her pain medication now or in an hour from now, there's an ethical choice that is made in that moment. The way that we approach patients to ask their permission to do things, the way we structure our work, how we use patients' preferences, the patient's story, their culture, the patient's values and beliefs. Those are all ethical situations that we face in the everyday, every night work of a nurse, which is quite different from some of the more dramatic representations that we sometimes think about in terms of right to life, pulling the plug, and so on. So, as I said in my opening remarks, the goal of this course is to help you develop reason. When faced with an issue, you'll be able to say, I looked at this issue from these 4 frameworks or these 5 frameworks or however many you have, and I worked with the team and I made the decision to carry out the following. Again, in exchange for having professional status, our contract with the public is that we are prepared to justify and explain our actions. And so the tools that I'll be giving you today, or the approaches, are yet more ways that you can explore the ethics in your everyday, every night practice. For those of you who are visual, you can see that last week we presented the 4 theories that are within the funnel. And this week we're explaining feminist relational care and narrative ethics, and you'll be able to add those to your repertoire. Okay, so moving right along then, what we're focusing on this week are the contextual theories. They have broad category names. So the theories that we presented last week were the general or the normative theories and mid-range theories, and this week it's the contextual theories. We'll be talking about the law next week, by the way. It's important to recognize that each of the various ethical theories or approaches or philosophies contribute something to our understanding of ethics. It's important to recognize that no one approach is a panacea. No one approach will give us everything that we need. Each approach has been heavily critiqued by scholars over time. And it's really up to you to discern what makes sense for you. Which approaches or which philosophies help you to understand your own values and beliefs and how they interface with ethical practice. So the approaches that we studied last week in terms of deontology and utilitarianism give us principles for that we can apply for moral practice. And we have to remember the context when these were developed. Life was much simpler. When Kant and John Stuart Mill were writing, there hadn't yet been the scientific explosion that we're living with right now. Virtue ethics, by contrast, considers the virtues the nurse requires to be moral in his or her practice. This is interesting because it starts to help us understand a little bit about how we enter into a relationship. And lastly, the contextual approaches lets us consider the wider complexities and social construction of the human experience and the human condition. These contextual theories call upon us to look at particular people, real people who are living their health in real situations and in particular relationships. These contextual theories search out and includes more details to explore the situation from an ethical perspective. These contextual theories are part of the ongoing discussion about what makes an ethical practitioner. It asks us to think about who gets to decide what is right or wrong, and begins the exploration of whose experience counts more, the patients or the nurses or the healthcare system. And as I discussed in the very first week, a course in ethics asks more questions than it answers. And I found this little cartoon that I thought I would put up for you. Listen, yes, I'm a hermit, but a simple hermit crab. I do not answer philosophical questions. I thought it would be a good time before we move into the explanation of these contextual theories to just give you credit for the really hard work that you're doing right now. We will have many opportunities in the remainder of the course to apply these theories. And so we're doing some practice in the discussion forums. Last week and this week, there are case studies for you to practice applying these different approaches to ethical reasoning. And I would encourage you to experiment and to give feedback to one another. And certainly I'll be in those forums trying to give you some feedback as well. It will become easier as we move through. We've been teaching ethics here at Georgian College for a few years now, and certainly we see that at the end the students are really very skilled at ethical reasoning. So this will happen for you as well. So just briefly, I'm going to present the next slide that gives a little overview of the genealogy of thought. Where did these ideas come in and what sequence are they being offered? It's quite important to recognize that we can only think as we do today because of the people who thought as they did yesterday, and that we're constantly building on and gathering more sophistication and more complexity to our reasoning, and that is only because of the thoughts that were available yesterday. Okay, so this slide, and I'm not going to go through every box, but this slide shows you a little example of or a summary of how ethical thought has evolved over time. And it's important to recognize that, as I mentioned in a few moments ago, that we can only think as we do today because of those who have come before us. So Aristotle is credited with being the first ethics scholar, and last week we studied the work of Kant and Mill, and you have already studied the work of Nightingale, who is considered to be one of nursing's first ethical thinkers. She was very interested in justice and social justice and promoting the good, in particular for those living in poverty. This week we'll be considering some of the feminist waves and some of the ways that feminists have helped us to think about ethics. So beginning in about the 1920s, although sometimes Nightingale is credited as one of the early feminists, but the feminists asked us to recognize that certain people, in particular women, have a different access to autonomy and to decision making, and that gendered knowledges hold less credibility than other forms of knowledge. And so the Feminist Project gave way to a feminist ethic, and we'll be discussing that in class. A landmark document that happened in 1980 was that the Canadian Nurses Association created a code of ethics. What the CNA was trying to do at that time was to create a document that would begin to define the professional ethical standards, begin to recognize that nurses had a unique contribution and that we could have a way of approaching practice as a discipline. Also in the 80s, again, we see a lot of activity in this time. There were studies about morals and studies about how people make decisions. And we'll look at these today, but Kohlberg and then Gilligan and then Nell Nodding's work in the 80s led to care ethics. Josephine Flaherty, who was from Ontario and was the chief nurse of Canada for a number of years, her work was instrumental in recognizing that the patient's rights and human rights and the nurse's ability to engage therapeutically were interconnected. Then Jan Storch looked at bioethics, and she came to an idea of narrative ethics, which we'll be discussing today. Then moving along, Anne Morehouse, who is a professor at Seneca College, by the way, Anne Morehouse and Michael Yeo have been spending time looking at how bioethics can be influential in healthcare. And Yeo and Morehouse published a book fairly recently, I think it's 2010, and it's quite interesting. And then Keatings and Smith. Keatings was the chief nurse at the Hospital for Sick Kids, and she and Smith did work looking at ethics and the law, and they've published substantially as well. And then Storch went on to look at further look at morals and narrative ethics, and did quite a bit of work in 2004, and again in 2012 have just released a newer edition of their book, which I hope is available to you in the library. It's an excellent book, and you will see that we use Storch's decision-making model in this course. In 2008, the Canadian Nurses Association revised the value statements and the ethical standards, and you will see that those are integrated into the textbook that we use for this course. Then Oberle and Raffen-Buchel published in 2009 the textbook that we're using, and there's quite a strong emphasis in their book on relational ethics. And this comes out of the notion that a lot of the work around relational ethics came out of Alberta, and Oberle and Raffen-Buchel are professors in Calgary, and they've taken up some of that work. And so I wonder which one of these ideas or which one of you will carry on in ethical scholarship. Certainly some of you may go on to be ethics scholars, but certainly each of you will go on to take what has come before and turn it into an ever-evolving ethical practice. As I did last week, this slide and the next slide are just examples of study notes that you can create. I make these because I recognize that we're really putting a lot of theory in the first few weeks of this class, and that it is heavy, and these little notes perhaps will help you to think about and understand these theories. So on this slide, there's the feminist ethics and the feminine or the care ethics. And on this slide, there's the narrative ethics and the relational ethics. Okay, so we're going to start with care ethics, which are sometimes considered feminine ethics, and it's not to be confused with feminist ethics because they're really quite different, as we will see. Okay, I'm just going to walk you through a little bit about how care ethics was sort of generated and how it came about. So in 1981, Kohlberg published a landmark study where he was trying to attempt to understand how people think about moral problems. What's interesting in this is that he positioned his study as people, and yet there was not a single woman in his study. So when he came up with 3 stages of moral thinking, or how people consider moral problems, the pre-conventional, the conventional, and the post-conventional, this was largely based on a male model, or what we would call androcentric perspectives. So Gilligan responded to Kohlberg's study and really critiqued. She did a feminist critique of his work, recognizing that we can't use studies that only had male subjects or male participants and then generalize that to the entire population. Again, you have to remember the context at that time. Many research studies and many implications for practice came out of research projects that were solely conducted with men. For example, all of the heart studies initially only had men in them. So anyway, Gilligan did a critique, and she realized that it was not appropriate to make these generalizations based on research conducted only with boys. So she did some of her own work and realized that girls reason differently from boys, and different does not mean less sophisticated. So we can see a little bit of feminism creeping into Gilligan's work here, where the hierarchy of knowledge and the fact that certain perspectives or certain ways of seeing the world are privileged, and Gilligan was contesting this. Gilligan suggested that boys were encouraged to be more detached and objective through their upbringing, and that girls were encouraged to be more connected with and to care for others. Again, part of that socialization and the social construction of knowledge. So out of Gilligan's work, Nell Notting recognized that the way that girls or women eventually approach situation in terms of caring for others had legitimacy and that it needed to be recognized. And this caring for others was a legitimate way of connecting morally with the world. And so Noddings came up with the idea of the ethics of care. So this is where decisions could be based on caring and based on relationships and based on the responsibilities that we have for one another. And this was presented in contrast to the way that Kohlberg had positioned moral action from Boys, which is decisions based on rules and ideas of justice and hierarchy, and personal rights being the prime consideration. So we can see that there's quite a distinction. And Nodding's contribution in terms of the ethic of care is really significant for us as nurses, primarily because we're a female-dominated workforce, but because much of our practice is based on the premise of care, that we enter into relationships, and that we have shared responsibility for the well-being of another. So Gilligan's feminist critique of Kohlberg's work, and some of this work is what Nell Noddings picked up, is that the morality of caring and responsibility is premised on nonviolence, and that the morality of justice and rights is based on equality and hierarchy. So the injunction, or the justice injunction for Kohlberg, is not to treat others unfairly, but the care injunction is not to turn away from someone in need. So we can see that there's quite a distinction between the two perspectives. Okay, so the work of initially Kohlberg and then Gilligan's critique of it, and then Nell Noddings taking up to develop the ethic of care, begins to address some of the inherent power relations. And in this way, it makes a contribution to the feminist project. And what Noddings was suggesting, or what care ethics suggests, is that to address power, the nurse must hear the other, know the other, and therefore this requires a relationship. And so in this way, the ethic of care recognizes the importance of the relationship and entering into a lived dialogue with the other. But especially feminist scholars thought that this was not enough, and that in some ways the ethic of care was perpetuating the gendered stereotypes. And you can read further about that in your textbook. And some of you may choose to write about feminist or feminine or care ethics in your paper, and you'll have another opportunity to explore the distinctions that these two schools of thought make to nursing. Okay, so at this point, if you haven't already done so, if you can pause the PowerPoint presentation and go and watch the segments of the WIT video. I'd asked you initially to watch the consent portion, but in the folder for week 3, there are other clips taking you to the end of the time chapter from the video. And if you could watch those and then come back, we're going to be using Dr. Baring's experience as our case study for this week. And the video really gives a poignant way for us to be able to consider, in particular, feminist ethics, in particular narrative and relational ethics. Okay, welcome back from the WIT video. It's a very powerful video, and as you're watching it, I wondered if you noticed what conflicts with care. So you have members of the healthcare team who are trying to act in a certain way, and yet there's a social organization to, for example, the nurse's work that makes it difficult for her to care in the way that she would like. So my previous question is really hitting at this central idea of who gets to decide. So the ongoing power relations and the ongoing hierarchy and social structures suggest that some people have more autonomy and have more ability to make decisions than others. And what feminist ethics enables us to do is to really zero in our exploration of power and ruling relations so that we can look at how that's organized. And when we understand where the power is and how power is organized, how power relations are organized, and what structures hold those power relations in play, we can begin to dismantle them. We can begin to expose them, and we can begin to react to them differently. So the feminist ethics then arises from two central areas of inquiry. One is that we pay attention to the contemporary ethical issues. What is happening in our midst right now that is creating ethical dilemmas? And one of the other is a criticism of traditional ethics theories. So initially, feminist ethics were very focused on female reproduction. But now feminist ethics are more broadly interested in issues that women face, in particular women who live in violence, poverty, or any form of social exclusion. So feminist ethics draw our attention to multiple and intersecting differences, recognizing that not all women are the same. And so women who are part of other groups that can marginalize or oppress will live with greater influences of power relations. So feminist ethics asks us to specifically look at how women experience race, resources, gendered knowledge, disability, sexual orientation, sexist occupational roles, and conflicts in relationships. The healthcare systems and professionals need to pay particular attention to the moral treatment of groups with multiple and intersecting oppressions. And what feminist ethics call upon us to act in ways that examine the structures of oppression within society. And it's through this type of work that we can create the good and contribute to overall happiness and inclusion of all. Storch, for example, in her writings about feminist ethics, asks us to think about how a particular patient's treatment contributes to a wider discrimination or exploitation of what surrounds that patient. The article that I chose for this week, the Marcellus article, is an example of a feminist ethics critique. So here we have a group of substance-using women who are also childbearing. And what happens to this group of women? What are the multiple and intersecting differences that are influencing their lives and their experience? And how is the social construction of those women influencing our views of what is ethical and what is right and what is good? So when we take a situation where our ethical sensitivities are suggesting that there are ethical tensions or an ethical dilemma, a feminist ethics approach would ask us to question who has the power in this situation and how does the power work? How can we fix inequities? And the ethical analysis can only proceed when context and difference are considered. So we have to look at the broader social context. We have to look at, what has happened before, what is the historical legacy of that particular group, and how does that influence what is happening today. So you can see that the kinds of questions that a feminist ethics calls upon us to question are quite different from those that, for example, a deontological ethic would ask us to consider. And we'll see that the goals of feminist ethics are also quite different from some of the perspectives that we discussed last week. So it really is about not winning. It's not about one truth or one single solution. It's really about finding meaning and finding the truth that is best for that individual person. And it really rebalances the power and puts it more aligned with the person actually having the experience than the all-knowing healthcare provider. The goal of feminist ethics is to help us understand how and why we treat each other as we do, and to understand the power and ruling relations that are structuring this. It asks us to dismantle ruling relations and to begin rebalancing equity so that the issues that, for example, certain groups face with in terms of disparity are addressed. And it brings us largely to the registered nurses' social mandate of social justice. So you'll have opportunities in the activity for this week in the case study, but I just wanted to pause now after I've made comments about feminist ethics to think about how a feminist ethics lens would influence our exploration of Dr. Baring's experience. What does a feminist ethics approach allow us to see in the care that she is receiving? And how might a feminist ethics approach alter that care? Okay, so we're going to make a switch to the third contextual theory, narrative ethics. So just to recap, we've talked about care ethics or feminine ethics, but it's typically referred to as care. Then we spent a considerable amount of time on feminist ethics, where we look at power and oppression. And now we're going to discuss narrative ethics. Narrative ethics will be quite familiar to you. Our curriculum is designed on the patient's lived experience and privileging the patient's unique and lived way of understanding and living out health and illness. And so narrative ethics is an extension of that approach. So when we use narrative ethics, it keeps the person and their lived experience and the meaning and significance that they're attributing to the event at the center of the exploration. Narrative ethics helps us to understand how the person and the ethical issues are joined, and it really keeps the unique lived experience of that person at the center. Tom's story and the OB cases in the Oberle and Raffin textbook are excellent examples for you to explore narrative ethics. So again, you'll have many opportunities in the online activity forum where we're discussing Dr. Bering's case, but I thought it would be interesting for you to consider at this point, how might the use of narrative ethics change Dr. Bering's situation or her experience with illness in the healthcare system? Had somebody asked her about her and her story, how might that have changed things? And the fourth type of ethics that we're discussing this week, and once again, I'm just making very brief comments, and the readings in the textbook and the readings in the selected articles for this week will certainly round out your understanding of these approaches. But the last is relational ethics. Relational ethics asks us to look at our commitments, which requires us to examine ourselves and to the lived reality of others. A quote that I particularly like: what relationships and commitments already inform the person that I am in this particular situation? And relational ethics is about repersonalization of ethics. So when we connect with others, when we enter into relationship, and you can see that relational ethics and narrative ethics have a natural affinity. But when we understand the other and we understand how our own values and beliefs are entering into this relationship with the other, we can see that we ask very, very different questions in terms of the ethics. So again, to prompt your consideration of Dr. Bering's story and the case study analysis that you'll be doing when you return to the discussion forums, it would be very interesting for you to consider how her care would have changed had care or relational ethics been used. Levine's very old work gives us some very interesting to think about in terms of moral rectitude. Ethical behavior is not the display of one's moral rectitude in times of crisis. It is the day-by-day expression of one's commitment to other persons and the ways in which human beings relate to one another in their daily interactions. And Levine's work here, for me, is very significant and connects to my earlier comments that in nurses' work, we're not so much involved in really dramatic, sensational ethical issues in terms of, DNR orders or turning off a ventilator or making decisions in terms of abortion. Our work as nurses is very much in the day-to-day interactions of another person, and our ability to understand the ethics of that situation and to expand our view of what is ethical and what is right is really key in terms of the person's experience and really key in terms of looking at how dignity and how human worth is considered and integrated and privileged in care. Okay, so as promised, there are still more questions than answers in this slide. But I'm wondering about the outcomes of a decision based on a relationship, and would these be quite different from the outcomes based on rules? So we can see that the approaches that were presented last week tend to be more based on principles and rules and duties and prescribed ways. And the contextual theories presented this week are more based on experiences with the individual and recognizing broader issues such as the institutional organization of healthcare, social and power relations, looking at context, looking at multiple intersecting differences, looking at hierarchies of knowledge. So we can see that the suggestion here is that one approach is not enough. and that what we're trying to achieve is to give you many different perspectives so that you can truly and deeply understand the experience and the ethical issues that are inherent in the situation. And when we can understand the full complexity of the situation, it enables us to come up with a multitude of possible solutions, thus allowing us to weigh them and hopefully ultimately work with our patient to come up with what is the good and what is best for that person. Johnson said, "Our leaders of tomorrow must be able to draw upon every tool available to them to support ethical nursing practice, and one such tool is philosophy. So while this is hard work, I think that in time you will see the contributions that philosophy can make to your reasoning." So I think it's important when we're talking about hierarchies of knowledge and we're talking about the privileged position that certain views have in others, that we recognize that in this course there are certain perspectives that have been left out. For example, Confucianism, Buddhism, indigenous ethics. We're only presenting certain ethical perspectives here, and that in and of itself can be critiqued. But what I wanted to do here is to recognize that there are other ethical perspectives out there, and I also wanted to invite any of you who might prefer to do an ethical analysis using a different perspective that has not been included in the course, that you write to me about this. You're going to have a chance to write a paper, and if I can support you using a different perspective, for example, indigenous ethics, it would be my pleasure and my to do that with you. I just need to make sure that I can adequately give you feedback or find somebody who can help me understand and read your paper and grade it. Okay, so the last activity or the last objective for this week is values clarification. And this is important work for us because what we recognize is that there are sometimes discrepancies between what we value and what we do. So the little questions that I asked you in week 1, asking you to use a Likert scale from strongly agree to disagree, perhaps highlighted some of that. There are ideas that we would say that are our values, but sometimes when it actually gets down to it, we do something else. And so part of ethical reasoning is recognizing the roles that our personal values play in this. The other is the recognition that our personal values and our professional values sometimes align nicely, sometimes they intersect, and sometimes they conflict. So there is a view that it is very important for us to understand our values and how these influence our knowledgeable practice. So the next activity is based on that. As I mentioned earlier, the Canadian Nurses Association and to a certain degree the College of Nurses of Ontario make the values that nurses are expected to uphold very clear. And in fact, there are specific value statements within the CNA ethics document that we'll be reviewing in this course. So what these documents do is that they inform the public of what to expect from nurses, but they also tell us, and in particular you as nursing students who are thinking about entering nursing, what to expect. And so there are predefined values that are associated with nurses and nursing work. And it's important for you to understand these and to reconcile how some of your individual perspectives and values can align. So as we understand and clarify our values, it helps us to understand moral life as we know it. And so our beliefs and values do make a difference. We can see that there are many, many shades of gray, and context matters in terms of what we might think is wrong, but when we're actually faced in a situation, we realize that perhaps it's not wrong at all. And the same can go for right, and the same can go for good. One of the questions that I like to pose: if a really caring nurse makes a mistake, is it less of an issue than if a less caring nurse makes a mistake? So that concludes the PowerPoint for this week. And I would ask you to please now join the discussion forums. But just before you do, I have a little joke for you to illustrate the idea of relational ethics. Hospital regulations require a wheelchair for patients being discharged. However, while working as a student nurse, I found one elderly gentleman, already dressed and sitting in the bed with a suitcase at his feet, who insisted he didn't need my help to leave the hospital. After a chat about rules being rules, he reluctantly let me wheel him into the elevator. On the way down, I asked him if his wife was meeting him. "I don't know," he said. "She's still upstairs in the bathroom, changing out of her hospital gown." Have a good week and see you in the discussion forums.